They didn't see a soldier, they saw a frail man gripping a thermos and a folded donor card like he might forget what day it was without them. And as I stood behind him in the blood drive line that morning, I watched the nurse purse her lips like she was about to ask him if he was lost, until he gently tapped the counter, not demanding attention, just patiently waiting his turn. He didn't say much, not then, not ever. But when he unbuttoned his sleeve to expose a forearm tattoo half faded by time. O.R.H. Null, handwritten in block letters. Everything in that room shifted, and no one laughed again. But that moment didn't come until much later. First, they had to mock him, write him off, crack their jokes, and I'll be honest, I almost did, too. Until I saw his hands, not shaking, not frail, but steady, like they'd held something heavier than blood before, something sacred. And before we go further, if you believe that age doesn't define worth, and that quiet dignity often carries the loudest legacy, go ahead and like and subscribe. Because what happened that day at the downtown hospital changed more than a little girl's fate. It changed how we all looked at the man we tried not to see. His name was Frank Davis, 83 years old. Former special operations medic in the Korean War and Vietnam. And when I first noticed him, he was already being underestimated. Lined up behind college kids in gym shorts and scrubs, his brown wool coat too warm for the room. A soft din in his cap. From years of habit, and that same small, worn thermos in his left hand like it was part of him. The guy in front of me, Derek, tight fade haircut, fresh hoodie, self-declared fitness nut, rolled his eyes and whispered loud enough to be heard. Bet the guy's here for the free juice. Probably faints at the sight of a needle, and a few people snorted. One even mimicked a wobble like they'd seen Grandpa trip over a curb. Frank didn't flinch, just looked straight ahead like the wall was more interesting than us. He stepped up slowly when they called next, unfolding a battered card from his wallet, tattered at the edges but laminated long ago, and Nurse Camille, young, sweet, tried to hide her hesitation when she saw his age. "Sir, are you here to donate?" she asked, as polite as a person can be while doubting you. He nodded once and said, "If you still take the rare kind, I've got a pint to spare." And for a second she didn't understand, until she looked down again, really looked, and saw the tiny letters, R.H. Null, the golden blood, the type so rare it exists in fewer than 50 people worldwide. Her face changed, instantly, and she waved over a supervisor without blinking, while behind us, Derek muttered, "What? Did the geezer win the lottery or something?" And someone else chuckled, oblivious. I took a step forward, curious now, and that's when Camille motioned to Frank, gently took his elbow, and led him to a private room. No fanfare, no announcement, but there was something in the way she did it. Like she knew this wasn't just about filling a bag, it was about saving someone. Because 2 floors up, in the pediatric ICU, a girl named Lily Thompson, 8 years old, unconscious, body rejecting every standard transfusion, was slipping fast, and the hospital had just sent out a call for R.H. Null in a desperate Hail Mary. They didn't know Frank had walked in that morning. Didn't know the man we all just mocked was the last name on a confidential global registry. A viable golden blood donor still able to give. And none of us in that waiting room, least of all Derek, had any idea that right then, Frank's blood was being rushed under armed escort straight to an OR. Where Lily's mother clutched a rosary in one hand and a sock puppet in the other, we just watched the old man disappear behind a curtain while the line moved forward, a little quieter than before. About 20 minutes later, Camille came out with her mask off, right around the eyes, and said, quietly to the desk, "Get security, make a path, he's a live match. And the kid won't make it through the hour without it." And you could have heard a paperclip hit the floor. No one laughed then, not even Derek, who had started chewing his lip like he suddenly tasted ash. And as Frank walked out of the donor room, still silent, still steady, they cleared the way, not out of duty, but reverence. He passed me with a nod, like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just done what no one else in the city. Good. And I wanted to say something, to apologize, to shake his hand. But he just gave a small smile and walked toward the vending machines, thermos still in hand, coat still buttoned, and when I looked again, I saw something different in him, not weakness, not age, but the kind of strength you don't brag about, the kind you earn the hard way, through decades of being written off, overlooked, and still showing up anyway. And that's when I realized Frank Davis didn't just give blood that day. He give a lesson none of us would forget. They say blood saves lives. But what they forget is that it's not just biology, it's legacy, too. And that morning, when Frank Davis rolled up his sleeve in that little side room with the rattling HVAC vent and the mismatched medical chairs. What spilled into that bag wasn't just red. It was everything he'd ever endured, everything he'd seen, everything he'd carried from places most of us only read about in history books. And when the nurse clamped that first tube and whispered, "He's a match," the room around her stilled like time itself had paused to bear witness. Upstairs, little Lily Thompson's monitor was ticking slower, every beep another inch closer to a headline no mother should ever have to read. And I didn't know her. I hadn't even known her name yet. But somewhere deep in that hospital, someone did. And someone was praying, while down in the lobby, Derek had gone quiet, tapping his phone screen like it might undo what he'd said earlier. That smug little, "probably here for the juice" line echoing back at him in shame. The staff moved fast now. Nurses, techs, orderlies, one even pushing a cooler marked critical match, with two gloved hands like it held something nuclear. And behind them, Camille held the clipboard to her chest like it was a holy text, her face pale but determined, and she passed by us without speaking, heading straight for the elevator that led to ICU 3C, where a little girl's veins were crying out for something no one else in this hospital could give. The moment I saw the look in Camille's eyes, I knew Frank's blood wasn't just rare, it was irreplaceable, one of only a few known donors worldwide with the Rh-null phenotype, also known as golden blood. And I remembered from some article years ago that hospitals rarely talk about it, because it's so scarce they don't want to cause panic. But in that moment, they weren't hiding anything. They were racing it upstairs with the urgency of a SWAT team on a bomb call. Frank came out a little later. Coat back on. Thermos refilled by one of the nurses who clearly knew now what the rest of us had just learned. This wasn't a man to be pitied. This was a man whose life had just saved another. And not in the poetic way, not with metaphor, but literally, chemically, medically, undeniably. He passed Derek on his way to the vending machines again, and Derek, God, I'll never forget it. He tried to say something, opened his mouth, but the words stuck like they couldn't pass through the shame lodged in his throat, and Frank just gave him that same polite nod as if to say, "It's all right, son. I've heard worse," and sat down quietly by the window, sipping his coffee, watching the rain streak the glass while a child he would never meet held on to life because of what he just did. I sat near him this time, maybe 5 feet away, unsure of whether to speak, but needing to be closer to whatever truth this man carried. And I noticed now that his thermos had dents in it. Small ones, like it had been dropped or slammed, or maybe even caught some shrapnel once. But he held it like it had never failed him, and maybe it hadn't. A few minutes later, a nurse came downstairs. Not Camille, someone older, with a tight bun and a clipped tone, and she went straight to Frank and said, "The transfusion stabilized her. They want me to tell you it worked." And Frank didn't flinch, didn't celebrate, just gave the softest exhale I've ever seen, like he'd just put down a weight that had been there so long he didn't know he was still carrying it. And the nurse added, "She's 8, sir, same age as your daughter would have been." And my heart dropped because now I knew that Frank hadn't just donated out of duty. He'd donated out of memory, out of grief, out of the kind of loss that turns silence into a second language. He nodded once and said, "I know." And that was it. No tears, no trembling hands. Just the stillness of a man who'd waited decades to do something that mattered in a way he could feel again. And I wanted to ask him about her, about the war, about the tattoo on his wrist, but I stayed quiet, because in that moment, words felt too small, too shallow for what this man had just done. And while I sat there, wondering how many Franks we'd all ignored in lines, in waiting rooms, in quiet corners of VA hospitals, upstairs in room 3C, a mother was sobbing into the bedsheets as the machines around her daughter began to normalize, and somewhere in the flurry of stabilization notes and chart updates, a doctor whispered, "Someone tell that man thank you." And that's when it really hit me. Most people would never know his name, never know his tattoo, never know that this was the only man in the state who could have made that moment possible, and Frank would never ask them to. I looked at him then, sitting in his brown coat, cap tilted slightly forward, thermos between his palms, and I realized that in a world full of loudness and ego, this man had saved a life quietly, humbly, completely, and didn't need anyone to clap for him, didn't even want it. And suddenly I felt ashamed of how many times I'd ignored someone like him, dismissed them, categorized them as just old. And it occurred to me that maybe the loudest kind of strength is the one that shows up, waits its turn, and saves someone without saying a word. That day, Frank didn't just give blood. He rewrote what heroism looked like for everyone who saw it, and none of us would ever be the same again. It happened 3 days later, quietly, the way most important things do. No cameras, no announcement. Just a sealed envelope slipped through the front doors of the Red Cross building with nothing on the front, but a child's uneven handwriting and a small sticker of a butterfly next to the name Frank, and I was there when the nurse opened it, her hands trembling slightly, already knowing what it might be. Inside was a folded piece of pink construction paper, the kind kids use in school art. Projects, and drawn on the front in bright markers was a stick figure girl holding hands with a stick figure man in a brown cap, with the words, "Thank you for giving me your brave blood, Mr. Frank," written in jagged crayon lines underneath. Attached with tape was a photo, faded and overexposed, but unmistakable, a little girl with hospital bracelets still on her wrist, smiling weakly and giving a thumbs up in a hospital bed. And I didn't even realize I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. Frank came in later that morning, not to donate, just to return the thermos a nurse had accidentally borrowed, but he froze when he saw the card taped to the wall behind the check-in desk, like someone had reached into a place he'd sealed off long ago and gently knocked. He stared at it for a long time, didn't say a word, then quietly walked over and smoothed the wrinkle near the edge like it was glass, like it might break if he touched it wrong. Nurse Camille walked over and said softly, "She's home now, sir." Lily, walking, talking, eating pancakes, and Frank didn't smile exactly, but his shoulders lifted a little, like he'd finally exhaled something he'd been holding in since Saigon. He looked over at me, and for the first time, asked my name. And I told him, and he nodded like that mattered somehow, and then said, "A girl that young deserves every sunrise." And that's when I realized something. I wasn't just watching a man do something noble, I was watching a man heal in real time. Piece by piece, because of what his blood had done, what it had meant, and what it had reminded him he still was needed. The next week, a box was delivered to the pediatric ward. No return address, just a tag reading for Lily. From an old medic who remembers what it's like to be small and scared. Inside was a plush military bear in desert camo, hand-sewn stitches along the arms, and a tiny tag around its neck that said, "You're braver than I ever was." Hospital staff cried when they saw it. Lily named it Sergeant Bear. A month after that, a small plaque was mounted at the blood drive center, near the vending machines where Frank always sat after donating, simple black letters etched into brass. The Frank Davis Station, 1 pint, 1 life, and even though Frank never stood next to it or pointed it out, I saw him glance at it once, tip his cap slightly, and then just walk on like it wasn't about him at all. Word started spreading, nurses told new volunteers. Med students whispered it in the halls. Even Derek, the guy who'd mocked him, signed up to donate every 56 days without fail, always asking if the old guy had booked the same appointment window. I saw Frank again a few months later, helping a nervous teenager calm down during her first ever donation. He just sat next to her, told her stories about patching up Marines in the jungle with nothing but gauze and grit, made her laugh until she forgot there was a needle in her arm. And when she asked if he was a doctor, he just smiled and said, "Just a guy who learned not to waste what he could still give." He never asked for recognition, never told people about the blood type, never bragged about what he'd done, but people started noticing. Anyway, the way he always stayed a little longer than necessary, the way he offered a seat, the way he wrote thank you notes to staff when he thought no one saw him. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Lily's family, her mother, her grandmother, and Lily herself showed up at the center unannounced, holding a tray of homemade cookies and a bouquet of wildflowers, and I swear the whole room froze. Lily wore a yellow sundress and had a new scar under her left arm, but she was smiling like the sun lived in her chest, and when Frank saw her, he took one step back like the gravity of it hit him all at once. Lily ran up to him and wrapped her arms around his waist like she'd known him forever, and Frank, stoic, quiet Frank, stood there for a long second, then slowly knelt to eye level and said, "I've waited a long time to meet someone this strong," and Lily replied, "Mom says I have your blood now, so I think we're kind of family." And Frank blinked fast, nodded once, and whispered, "Then make it count." And in that moment, the world felt smaller, kinder, and fuller than it had in years. Frank still comes every few months, slower now, cane in hand, but always early, always prepared, and always greeted like an old friend. And every time I see him sit down by the vending machine, thermos resting on one knee. I remember the day we all laughed at a man we didn't understand, and how that man saved a life just by showing up. I used to think heroism was loud, maybe even shiny. Now I know it's a quiet knock at the door, a steady hand, and a man who never needed to prove anything, but did anyway, by bleeding grace into the veins of a stranger who will never forget him, because neither will I.